After being shot 12 times the morning of September 6, 2018 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and miraculously living to tell about it, Whitney Austin founded Whitney Strong, an organization dedicated to finding common ground to end gun violence through data-driven, responsible gun ownership solutions. Thank you so much, Whitney Austin, for joining us here at AwareNow to share your story and to share the space. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we're just going to get serious right away and talk about a serious subject that's seriously hard to talk about sometimes. When it comes to gun violence, there are the stories that we see on the news, and then there are the stories that we hear by those who have survived it. For those who have not yet heard your story, Whitney, will you please share what happened to you the morning of September 6, 2018?
Yeah, so I was a banker and was often in a position to spend my workday in Cincinnati, Ohio. I actually live in Louisville, Kentucky. So what that looked like was about an hour and a half trip up 71 north from Louisville to Cincinnati. And so on that day, September 6th of 2018, it was just one of those days where I knew I was going to need to drive up to Cincinnati. And it was just a normal morning, like every other morning going to Cincinnati. I kissed my kids as I left my house around 7. My husband, kissed my husband, and got in the car and did all the usual things, from listening to podcasts, talking to my peers, just, to pass the time. And as I descended into the city, I needed to join a conference call with my legal and compliance partners, which is code for this was an important call. I needed to pay attention to what was being discussed. And so I have a really great sense of focus, and I was focused on that call. So much so that as I approached Fountain Square, which is where my employer's corporate headquarters is located, I can remember that I was concerned about 5th Street traffic. So as I went across the crosswalk, making sure that everybody was, not going to run me over. But then once I got past that perceived risk, there weren't any other risks in my head to consider. So back to focusing on the conference call. And there was a huge risk looming. I just didn't notice it. And it was that no one was on the square, which was a very abnormal thing for 9 a.m. during the workday. And also that there was shattered glass in the revolving door that I usually use to enter into the building. But I don't come from an environment in which I recognized what bullet holes looked like. I just thought that's a little weird that there's shattered glass in the door. And as I processed that, I then processed, well, no big deal, just go into work. And I pushed on the revolving door with my right arm, and that's when the first barrage of bullets hit me all across my body. And it was so forceful that I collapsed into the bottom of the revolving door. And I immediately thought, well, these have to be bullets. Nobody's close enough to me for this to have been anything else. And then I immediately thought, and this must be a mass shooting. That's what happens in America. That's what this is. This is a mass shooting. And the next thought was, well, I have to live. I have to get back to my babies. I have to get back to my husband. How do I live? And I didn't really have any good options. I tried to stand up, and I was too weak to push myself up because my arms were too badly damaged. And then I noticed at that point that no one was on the square, so there wasn't anyone to save me. And then my last thought was, let me call 911 to get somebody here to rescue me. And when I went to move my left arm to get back to my phone, that's when the next barrage of bullets came, because the shooter knew that I wasn't yet dead. And so that was absolutely the worst moment in all of it, as I sat there coughing up blood. praying and thinking that this was going to be the end of my life and that I would never, ever get back to my family. But very soon after, the Cincinnati police officers arrived on the scene. And when I say soon after, it was exactly 1 minute from the moment I was shot the first time to the moment they arrived. So just 1 minute, but many, many, many thoughts. They arrived and they did everything exactly right for me to ensure that they could rescue me from the revolving door and get me to the hospital as soon as possible. And the next string of things get a bit blurry, but I remember waking up in the hospital and being surrounded by my husband and the most amazing nurses and doctors, and all of them saying, "You're a miracle. You were shot 12 times, but none of the bullets hit any major organs or arteries." And, I tell this story a lot. When I'm really present and in the moment, I am just overcome with gratitude because nobody gets to hear that. And that's what I got to hear. And that was really the genesis of building Whitney Strong and the work that I do today, because I know I got something that nobody else gets.
Thank you so much for sharing that story again. I imagine every time you share it, it's so powerful, so profound. So in USA Today, you were quoted saying, "I know that preserving the Second Amendment and reducing gun violence are not mutually exclusive goals." I love this. As both a gun owner and a gun violence survivor, would love to hear your thoughts, Whitney. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, when my husband and I were sitting in the hospital after the shooting, my brain was really overactive and started to think about how we could build something different and really accelerate change on this issue. And we felt as if what was missing in this movement was an organization that was focused on bringing people together. That much of the work being done on this issue was highly political, was at times anti-gun, and none of that made any sense to us, coming from a place in which we understood, we believed, everyday Americans that supported change on this issue. And when we say everyday Americans, we mean Republicans, Democrats, gun owners, non-gun owners, folks from rural areas, folks from urban areas, and that what was missing is a place in which everyone felt safe. And so we still focus on common ground as our key strategy for change, even today, almost 5 years later. And that quote from USA Today really plays into it. So we are a gun-owning family. We owned guns before I was shot, and we still own guns today. To get into debates about whether guns are good or bad are futile. We live in the United States of America. We have the Second Amendment. And if you are living in reality, and I'm certainly living in reality, the Second Amendment is going to stand. That's not up for dispute. What is up for discussion is what we can do to reduce harm when it comes to firearms. So whether it's reducing injury or reducing death, we can all agree that much needs to be done. So how can we apply the public health tried and true methods of reducing automobile accidents, reducing smoking? There are so many examples of public health change that we've seen over the last several decades in our country. We need to apply the same thing to this issue of gun violence. And we can do it in a way that respects the Second Amendment, but also respects that we have a right to live in this country without being victims of gun violence.
Absolutely. So let's talk a bit about Whitney Strong, because it wasn't enough for you to survive gun violence. You had this desire, this mission to stop it. So here enters what you founded, Whitney Strong. And so, as opposed to being driven by trending speculations or popular opinions, the actions taken by Whitney Strong are data driven. I'd love for you just to share what you are doing differently than others, perhaps, with your science-based approach.
Well, at Whitney Strong, we have 3 areas of focus: education, research, and bipartisan-led legislation. And data, the way that we utilize data to drive us looks a little bit different with each of the areas of focus. So, as an example, with education, we believe that there is much that can be done as individuals, as community leaders, to make our communities safer. And education looks like making sure people understand what safe handling of a firearm looks like, what safe storage looks like, what stop the bleed training can do for your community, what suicide prevention training can do for your community. And these are all evidence-based trainings that we provide, but more importantly, we're providing it where the data says communities are most on fire, I often say. So, for example, in the city of Louisville, there are 5 neighborhoods that have higher levels of homicide than other neighborhoods. And so that's where we bring our education work. Hopefully, we will be able to expand that program into other areas of Kentucky and other states as well. And there's an argument for the data would take us to the counties, for example, that see the highest rates of suicide. So always using data to determine where we should put our resources. On the issue of, or on the area of focus that is research, that one is tied to data in all the ways. And what people should know is, as a country, we have understudied gun violence. We've actually seen some good change on this in the last several years. In 2019, Congress came together again and said, we're going to study gun violence to the tune of $25 million after refusing to study it for 2 decades. So things are picking back up, but we have multiple decades to make up for. So where we have extra dollars, we'll put them toward research so that we can make sure that the solutions we're pushing, whether it's the education solutions or the policy solutions, are backed by research and data. And then the last area of focus is the bipartisan-led legislation, and data definitely rears its head here. And when it comes to the policies that we pursue at the state or federal level, we follow what the data tells us. So there is good polling data out at this point that helps us understand what policies see broad support from both major political parties. And if your ear isn't to the ground, if you're not looking at the data, then you'd say, nobody agrees on anything. That's not what we're doing. That's why we're not doing anything. That's not true. The data is actually telling us the opposite, that there are multiple policies that see broad support from both major political parties. Now, we need our elected officials to believe in that data, and that's a totally different ballgame. But I do believe that in the end, the elected officials will do what the people want if the people are loud enough. And so just to give you examples, comprehensive background checks is a policy that sees broad support from both political parties. And then there are some policies that are less known, well known, and they're good policies as well. So I've seen recent polling data that shows that both major political parties support a 72-hour waiting period before a firearm can be taken home after purchase, which in research is shown to be very effective in reducing suicide by firearms. So there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of good data. And I think it's really important to hitch your cart to an organization that inspires you, that gives you specific actions that you can take so that you can be part of the change.
Absolutely. Um, so at the end of the day, well, at the beginning of the day, rather, whether it's gun violence or any other subject, to effectively address it, we first must understand it, of course. And so I will confess to you here and now that in school, math wasn't a subject I understood very much, but I did understand fractions. I understood that when adding or subtracting, a common denominator was required to find a solution. So this understanding, the same understanding is at the core of Whitney Strong, with a board that consists of gun owners and non-gun owners. And as you mentioned, Republicans, Democrats. My question for you is, how has this made your organization more efficient and your work more effective?
Sometimes I'd say it's not more efficient because if you're taking the time to hear both sides of the coin, you've got to work through more. But in the end, I truly believe that you get to a better solution. And I think what a lot of people are missing on this issue is that people own guns for a whole host of reasons. And the experience of, what my experience is like living in a city versus the experience of someone who's living in a more rural area is very, very different. And so both sides of that coin needs to be considered. And so back to the question that is, what do you believe it makes you more effective? Absolutely. If anybody believes that they can go into the realm of advocacy and get 100% of what they want, I'd say they're not living in reality. That's not the way our system works. But what is realistic is that you could go in educated from both sides of that coin, and you can guide a conversation to get you policy change that can really make a difference, that can save lives, can reduce the number of injuries we're seeing every year. And that in the end is worth it. And so by doing this in a bipartisan way, by seeking common ground, I absolutely believe and have witnessed us get closer to change than what we had seen previously. So I certainly encourage people to take our approach.
I mean, it makes so much sense, to address the issues as things are being worked through, as opposed to waiting to just the end and having to make a hard case, but to be able to co-curate and co-create these policies. Because there is no single reason why gun violence occurs, you tackle the issue from multiple angles. Again, beyond legislature, you shared the different tools that you use. So again, taking that multifaceted approach. And so as an organization, you have the resources to do that, go at it from all of these different angles. I guess my last question for you is, for those of us who are not organizations, but just individuals who often feel very powerless against this rising gun violence we have in our country, what advice do you have? What can I do as an individual to make this change that's so needed?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that question, and also that you mentioned that this is a multifaceted problem that requires many solutions coming together, working in concert to make a change. And so as to what you can do as an individual, a lot. So one of the most important things you can do, whether you're a gun owner or gun owners, is to impress the importance of safe storage. We know that mostly school shooters have easy access to a firearm in the home. We know mostly that especially youth struggling with suicidal thoughts that die by suicide by firearm have easy access to a family firearm. And even that some criminal activity is completed with firearms that are stolen. So that is one universal tool that can make a major difference on this issue. So safely store yourself, and encourage those in your life that you know and love that have guns to safely store. The second thing that's really important, I've talked about suicide quite a bit in this conversation, because actually the largest number of gun deaths every year is attributed to suicide by firearm. And mostly people don't know the warning signs of suicide. We're in the midst of a youth mental health crisis, and it would behoove everyone who has children and loves children to learn the warning signs of suicide, to prepare themselves to have conversations with people who are struggling, and to know the mental health resources that are available in their community. And certainly we have a training that can do this, but many of the mental health organizations across the country have trainings that can help you with this. One specific training is called QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer. You can be trained in an hour and a half as a layperson, and you'll be in a better position to help with this. And then lastly, I would encourage people to get involved in advocacy, because I alone am not going to affect legislative change. My organization alone isn't going to affect legislative change. It will be all of us working together that will convince our lawmakers to take votes on this issue in the way that we want them to. And so certainly as an individual, you are empowered to do that. You can make a phone call, you can send a letter, you can show up at your state capitol, you are empowered to do that. But if all of that feels overwhelming, oh boy, I've never, I'm not thinking about doing that, then you can work through an organization like Whitney Strong to do it. And so we regularly educate our supporters on the actions they can take to reach out to lawmakers at both the state and the federal level. And I can provide evidence of hope. In the summer of 2022, spent several weeks in Washington, D.C., lobbying for the Safer Communities Act, which was the first piece of federal gun safety legislation in more than 28 years. It was no small feat. And as we were in and out of congressional offices, the feedback we heard consistently was, we're getting 2 to 3 times the outreach on this that we have seen historically. So when their phone calls are ringing off the hook, when their inboxes are full, it really does work. And so I'd encourage you to participate with Whitney Strong. You can opt in through whitneystrong.org. You can follow us on social media at whitstrong.org, but we will give you opportunities to raise your voice, and you should never question if it matters. It matters. Every single time it matters.
That is great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, for sharing the tools that we have that maybe we didn't know prior to this conversation. Thank you for helping all of us become a bit more aware now. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.